So given a quadratic function in standard form, another method to solve is completing the square. So you can do quadratic formula, which we just learned, or you can complete the square. This means you can find the zeros. So the solutions that we just learned about, like where it crosses the x-axis, they're called zeros. They're also known as x-intercepts. They're also known as solutions. They're also known as roots. So anytime you hear any of these four words, zeros, x-intercepts, solutions, roots, they all mean the same thing. Because when we're talking about a quadratic function, we're talking about a parabola. Parabola is going to have this shape to it. It's going to look like this, or it's going to look like this. And it's going to be where it crosses the x-axis. And it may not cross the x-axis. If it doesn't cross the x-axis, that means it doesn't have a zero. It doesn't have an x-intercept. It doesn't have a solution. It doesn't have a root. So we just talked about standard form when we talked about quadratic formula. So standard form means when everything's on one side. So let's talk about completing the square. So our first step is we want to rearrange, and we're going by this example here. So what you want to do is you want to, first of all, move the 6 to the other side. And you're going to leave a blank there, and that's why I put that there. You want to leave a space, move 6 to the other side, and if that negative 6 goes to the right side, it's going to become positive. Now, step 2 is you're going to rewrite the equation from step 1 and add the constants needed to complete the square. So we already have, so here's our 6. We already have that 6 there. So what you're going to do is you're going to take half of 4 and square it. And you're going to write it like this. Half of 4 is 2. And you're going to square it just like this. Okay? You don't necessarily have to write it out. You're not going to turn it into a 4. It's easier to write it like this. Okay? Because it's going to kind of help you kind of in the long run. Okay? So that's the step. You always take half of this number and square it. Take half and square it. We're going to do that a lot, these next few steps. Okay, so then you're going to factor, then solve to find the zero. So that word should be then. Factor, then solve to find the zeros. So you're going to take the 2 is going to go here. So that 2 just comes right there. You're going to put it in parentheses, and it's going to be squared. And then what you're going to do is you're just going to combine these, so 6 plus 2 squared, and that's going to be 10. Okay, so this is step 3. Now, I'm going to go ahead and tell you, you're going to have some questions in your assignment, and I'm going to ask for step 3 as a question in your assignment, and this is what I'm asking for. I want to know what this is right here. So when I ask for step 3, this is what I'm asking for. I'm asking for this particular part right here, okay? Now, we've already done this. I'm going to go ahead and fill it in over here because there's 2 different ways to go from here. There's 2 different types of questions that can be asked. You can either be asked, you can factor, then solve to find the zeros. So let's go ahead and finish it from here. If we factor, then solve to find the zeros. Well, since this is squared, what you can do is you can take the square root of both sides. And if you take the square root, remember when you take the square root of something squared, that's just going to turn into x plus 2. This is going to turn into plus or minus the square root of 10. Now, we would need to simplify the square root of 10. 10 doesn't have any factors that are perfect squares, so that's why it's just going to stay the square root of 10, because there's nothing we can do with the square root of 10. We need to move our 2 to the other side, and we're just going to write it x equals negative 2 plus or minus square root, oops, I didn't mean to write that, plus or minus square root of 10. That should have been a 10. And that's it, because you can't combine the 2 and the square root of 10, or the negative 2 and the square root of 10, because remember we talked about that in Unit 1. You can only combine if they are alike. So that's your answer. That's if you solve. Okay, now let's talk about identifying if it's a max or a min by looking at it in this form. So if it's a max or a min, what you can do, you simply move 10 to the other side. So if 10 goes over to the left side, it's going to be negative 10. And what we would do is we look at this number and this number because this is considered vertex form. And so you take the opposite of the number in the parentheses and you leave the 10 as is. So it's going to be negative 10. Okay? So this is your vertex. And you look out front, you just kind of look in and, this area right here. And since it's positive because there's no negative out front, that means that it opens up. Okay, it's a smiley face. So it's positive, so it opens up. It's a smiley face. And that means your point is down here at the bottom, which means it is a minimum. So that's the other type of question that you may have to answer on these problems. And so this would be negative 2, 10. Negative 2, negative 10 would be your vertex, and it's a minimum because it's at the bottom. It's at the bottom of your smiley face. Okay. So let's talk about completing the square. So this is just kind of an exercise to get us practicing completing the square. So this is just kind of step 1. Take half of 6 and square it. Well, half of 6 is 3. We're just going to write 3 squared. So this is super easy. Half of 12 is 6 and square it. Half of 2 is 1 and square it. Now, if you have an odd number, you do want to write them as fractions, okay? You don't want to do decimals. Fractions are actually your friend. Fractions are friends in these, and trust me, when we get to ones that are going to be like these. So, half of 7, we're going to write as 7 over 2, and you just square it. You don't actually have to square it. You're just going to write it like this. Keep it simple, okay? Half of 21, just put 21 over 2 and square it. Put it in parentheses like that. And then half of 3, you just do 3 over 2 and square it. You don't actually have to fully square it, okay? You can just write it just like this. So that's kind of our step 1 just for a little practice here. Okay? All right, so this example is just find the maximum and the minimum of the parabola by completing the square. So this is doing like we did on that second part. Okay, so remember, this one is, let's see here. Okay, so this one's very similar to the other one. It's just a plus instead of a minus, so it's very similar. So we'll do it. So x squared plus 4x. Remember, leave our space. Move 6 to the other side. So it's now going to be negative 6. Okay. So now what we can do, we're going to take half of 4 and square it. Half of 4 is 2. So we're going to add 2 squared, add 2 squared to both sides. Okay. So now our next part is where we factor. So we're going to write x plus 2 squared. So you just bring down the x is all you do. Just bring down the x, bring down the 2, put these in parentheses, and it's like your square is moving to the outside. This will be the same steps every single time. This will be the same. And then just simplify this right here. Negative 6 plus 2 squared. And that's going to give us negative 2. Now, on this part, if we are just identifying the max and the min, what we can do, actually, we can look at the beginning. Look at your x squared. It's positive. So if it's positive, think smiley face. It's a parabola that opens up. Therefore, we've got our point at the bottom. So it's going to be a minimum since it's down at the bottom. Okay. Now, we can move our 2, move this 2 to the other side. So if we move it, it's going to be plus 2. We already got our minimum. We've already got that right down. Remember, this is our vertex. So I told you if it's in parentheses, take the opposite. You do the opposite for this one, do the opposite for that one, and this one you take just as it is. And there's your vertex. Okay, so for the next one, completing the square. This one, you've got x squared minus 6x. Leave your space. Move that 6 to the other side, so it's going to be negative. Okay, so now take half of 6, which is 3. So put plus 3 squared, plus 3 squared. Okay, so now bring down your x. Keep the same sign. I forgot to mention that. If this is a minus, you keep it a minus. It's always the first sign, always the first sign. Before, we always had pluses, so we didn't have much to think about. Bring down your 3 and bring down your square. Square goes on the outside parentheses. And then just combine, just add those up. So 3 squared is 9. 9 plus negative 6 is 3. Okay, so this one, that x squared is positive. Positive means happy. Think about drawing a smiley face parabola. So therefore we have a min because that point is at the bottom. Okay, if I move that 3 to the other side, it's going to be a negative 3. So remember, this one you do a opposite. That's the opposite. This 3 you take as is. And so there's your vertex. Okay, and then on this one, we've got x squared plus 2x. Move 1 to the other side. Now I'm going to take half of 2, which is 1. So plus 1 squared plus 1 squared. Now when I factor, bring down the x. My first sign is a plus, so I bring down a plus. I bring down my 1. I square on the outside, and I add these up, and I'll get 2. Okay, this is a positive. Positive means happy, so I'll draw my parabola smiley face. My point is at the bottom, therefore it's a minimum. When I move my 2 to the other side, it becomes negative. So when I write my points down, my 1, this, remember, if that one becomes opposite, this one stays the same. Okay, so that is finding the maximum and the minimum. Now, we're going to move on to solving. So just, it's to an we do the same in the beginning, but then we actually solve. Okay, so we have x squared plus 2x. Move the 1 to the other side, so it's going to become negative. Half of 2 is 1, so I put plus 1 squared plus 1 squared. Okay, bring my x down. I've got a plus. There's my plus. I bring down a plus. Bring down my 1. Put my square on the outside. I combine these, which is going to be a 0. Okay, so from here I'm solving. So I'm not doing quite the same that I did on that last example. So from here, what I'm going to do, if this is squared, I want to get rid of the square. So I want to take the square root of both sides. And when I take the square root, that just turns into x plus 1. Now remember, normally when we're taking the square root of both sides, I get a plus or minus. Okay? But that's a 0, and 0 is not really plus or minus. So this is an instance where that's just a 0. Okay? Because 0 can't be plus or minus. Okay? So I just have x plus 1 equals 0. And now I'm just going to solve. I'm just going to subtract 1. And x equals negative 1. And there's my answer. Okay, so for B, I've got x squared plus 3x. I'm going to move my 2 to the other side, so it's going to be negative 2. Now I've got an odd number. So remember what I told you earlier about odd numbers? Leave them as fractions. So I'm going to put plus 3 over 2 squared plus 3 over 2 squared. Okay, so my first part here, when I factor, I've got x, my sign is a plus, I'm going to put a plus, 3 over 2 squared equals, so now I'm going to combine this. I want this to be a fraction. I want to leave it as a fraction, okay? Now, Desmos will leave these as fractions. Your calculator will convert these to fractions. So if I just real quickly here, let me figure out what this is. So let's see, 3 over 2 squared. I'm going to figure out, and then plus negative 2. So that's going to give me 1/4. Okay, I want that to be a fraction. And if you leave it as fractions, what's going to happen here is when you take the square root, this number is always going to be a perfect square. That's the nice thing that works out about these. If it's not, you've messed up somewhere. Okay, that's the nice thing about these fractions. This number, that number that I just highlighted, will always be a perfect square. So now we're ready to take the square root. You're always going to take the square root at this point. So the square root and the square, those are going to cancel each other out. So we're left with x plus 3 over 2 equals plus or minus. Now, the square root of 1/4, think of it as taking the square of both parts. The square root of 1 is 1. The square root of 4 is 2. Now, here's another nice thing about this part. If you've done everything correctly, these numbers should match. They should, if you've done everything right. And so now I can write this as one fraction when I move 3 over 2 to the other side. So if I subtract 3 over 2, if I subtract 3 over 2 from the other side, notice I've got the same denominator now. So I can write this. I'm going to go over here. Let me go over here. I've got x equals negative 3 plus or minus 1 all over 2. Since it's the same denominator, I can put the 3 and the 1 on top together. So I can do negative 3 plus 1. So negative 3 plus 1 is negative 2 over 2. And negative 3 minus 1 is negative 4 over 2. Okay, so all it is negative 3 plus 1 is negative 2, and then negative 3 minus 1. And so I reduce each of these. So I get negative 1, and this is going to reduce to negative 2. Okay? All right. So that's how odd numbers work. So even fractions and odd numbers, they still work out to be sometimes nice and neat. So on C, I got x squared plus 12x. I'm going to leave my space, move 4 to the other side. It's going to become negative. So half of 12 is 6. So I put plus 6 squared plus 6 squared. So now I'm ready to factor. So I've got x plus, because I got a plus there, 6 squared equals, so then 6 squared plus negative 4 is going to give me 32. Now I'm ready to take the square root of both sides. So this is going to give me x plus 6 equals plus or minus. So now I'm ready. I have to reduce the square root of 32. Okay? So remember, if we reduce that, I got to think of a perfect square that goes into 32, which is 16. 16, the square root of 16 is 4. So that reduces to 4 square root of 2. So I get 4 square root of 2 is what that's going to turn into. And then I subtract 6. So when I write it out, I get negative 6 plus or minus 4 square root of 2. And you always want to put your whole number in the front. And like anything that's like with square root, that's going to come last. Okay. Now on D, it's slightly it is not really in the form that we want. We need to move that 4x, that negative 4x, it needs to be over here with the x. I'm going to leave my space. The negative 1 is already on the right side. Okay, so now I've got it set up. I'm ready to take half of 4, which is 2. So 2 squared, 2 squared. Now I'm going to bring x down. This is a plus, so I put a plus. Bring my 2 down and squared here. So 2 squared is 4. 4 plus negative 1 is 3. I take the square root of both sides. So now I have x plus 2 equals plus or minus square root of 3. 3 can't be reduced. There's no perfect squares that go into 3. So all I do is subtract my 2. And I'll get x equals negative 2 plus or minus square root of 3. All right, on E, kind of the same thing. I need to move that negative 2x over to the other side. Leave my space. Negative 3 is already on the right side. Half of 2 is 1. So I have plus 1 squared plus 1 squared. You got to do it on both sides. So now I bring down my x. This is a plus. I do a plus. Bring down my 1. Put my square on the outside of those parentheses. So I get negative 3 plus 1 squared. So negative 3 plus 1 is going to be negative 2. Now I'm ready to take the square root of both sides. The square root and the square cancel each other out, and I'm left with x plus 1 equals plus or minus. Now, when I simplify the square root of negative 2, 2 can't be simplified. There's no perfect squares that go into 2, but I need to pull out that negative. And remember, that negative is going to turn into an I. Okay? And now I need to move my 1 over to the other side. And the 1 is going to go out in front. And I write it like that. Okay. All right, on F. Okay, so I already have a 9 on the right side. So I can combine the 1 with it. So I have x squared plus 2x. If I subtract the 1 with it, that's going to give me 8 over there. Okay, so half of 2 is 1, so I've got plus 1 squared, plus 1 squared. Now I have x. This is a plus, so I put a plus. And then there's the 1. Put the square on the outside of the parentheses. And then I'm going to get 8 plus 1 squared is going to give me 9. Okay? So now I'm ready to take the square root of both sides. Notice this is just these same steps over and over and over. So the square root of x plus 1 squared is just going to be x plus 1. And I get plus or minus. The square root of 9 turns into 3. So now here's one where our square root's going away. So this is one where I'm going to be able to get numbers in our answer, just like A and B. So the difference is on these problems, when I'm able to get numbers for my answers, A and B, my square roots went away. No problems where I'm not able to get like 2 different numbers was like C and D and E. The square roots didn't go away, so I wasn't able to get like 2 separate answers. Okay? So F, I'm going to subtract 1. So what this means is that you have negative 1 plus or minus 3. What this symbol means is you're going to do negative 1 plus 3, and you're going to get an answer, which is 2. And you're going to do negative 1 minus 3, which is negative 4. So you get these 2 answers. That's what that plus or minus symbol means. Is you got to do both. You got to add and you have to subtract. Okay. Now, there's 3 more problems, but we're not going to do these when you have a number out front. We're going to skip over these for now. We're just going to focus on completing the square when the x squared is just 1. So we're going to leave it at this just for now.